This conference will now be recorded.
I think we could now start. Frank, would you want to kick off?
Yes. Good morning. Welcome to the webinar, Data Sharing in Agriculture and the Code of Conduct. I'm very happy to see that the last webinars we had close to 100 participants, and today we have even around 150 registrations, so that's a huge public. We still see some attendees coming in. My name is Frank Berkers. I'm the work package leader of the work package 4 of SmartAgriHubs, called Digital Innovation Hub Capacity Building and Monitoring. I'm very happy to introduce today Simone van der Burg, a senior researcher at Wageningen University, specialized in ethics. Jérôme Bandry, the Secretary General of CEMA, and my colleague Caroline van der Weerdt, a senior consultant on human behavior change, and my colleague Kristina Karanikalova, an innovation policy researcher. So we can kick off. We have some instructions to make this run smoothly. The webinar will be recorded for sharing in the SmartAgriHubs community. Please keep yourself muted, except for the speaker, of course. The same applies for the video. Turn off your video unless presenting. Please ask questions using the chat, and please also include what type of organization you are from, such that we can moderate better. My colleague Caroline will moderate the questions and comments. During the presentation, we will also use menti.com for some interactions, and you will receive some further instructions. I think I can give the word now to Jérôme. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to now have sharing of the views of CEMA when it comes to data and agricultural machinery and sharing of that data. CEMA, as you know, is the trade association representing the interests of the agricultural machinery producers. I think, Caroline, you'll have to move the slides for me because something's not working here, if it's okay for you.
Just let me open them.
Can you move the slides for me?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Just give me a second so that I can share my screen again.
Okay, there we go. Thanks again. So Jérôme Bandry, Secretary General of CEMA, thanks for the opportunity. If you want to move to the next slide, obviously for manufacturers of ag machinery, the issue of data and the sharing of data is something of key importance. And nowadays, when you talk data, the first thing you put next to it is privacy, right? Privacy is the first thing to take care of. And in Europe, we're lucky enough to have a GDPR regulation that captures and puts a framework on anything that is linked to data privacy when it comes to identification of the person. But of course, then it raised the question of how you can handle data in other applications or in applications where personal data will also be linked to more business-like data handling. And here, basically, we have two paths to deal with this. The first path is to quote unquote force it with an approach that would deal with open data sharing. Next slide, please. Or the second path is the one we would rather use. If you move to the next, yeah, thanks, which is creating the framework for the right conditions to be in place so that we can leverage not only the willingness to share the data, which has always been there, but also creating the trust through the right framework that the people that actually have the data, generate the data, are willing to share it for getting value out of it. And this is the approach we have taken as CEMA to drive this code of conduct. So what are the goals of this code of conduct? It's basically a series of principles, a tool, nothing that has a legal weight. Of course, it will include all the references to the legal framework and to the EU legislation that is in place, but it is non-binding guidelines. It is something voluntary that again will try to support a prosperous agri-food chain, bringing benefits for all through the data sharing when it comes to agricultural data. So the main goals you will see in the codes rotate around keywords like mutual understanding, principles of transparency, responsibilities, driving the right behavior in order to create this trust among partners. There's no question that the willingness to share the data is there. There's no question that the value added of sharing data is clear. It's more about creating the trust. So if you move to the next slide, please. The principles we worked on in the codes were, of course, to start first around the contractual arrangements, because this is where we have the best experience and understanding. And in there, it needs to be crystal clear that the notion of permission to collect, access, store, and use the data must be central. And it can't be just a permission that is given without understanding. So it needs to be explicit, express, and informed. And there, of course, the data originators, the owners of the data, the ones that are the origin of the data, will have this leading role in not only controlling the access, but also deciding when to transmit or not to transmit, and benefiting from the action of sharing the data. Not all data is equal. There needs to be a recognition that some of the data will be protected, trade secrets, intellectual property, but also some data needs to be handled from a cybersecurity point of view. There's a lot of data that is irrelevant, wouldn't make a lot of sense when used, but can have a lot of impact, especially when it's used in a piece of machinery. So the protection of the privacy, but also the necessary security are key notions. Liability, who will be responsible for what if things go wrong, and of course connection with the GDPR, respecting the framework of the GDPR, not creating any prejudice here. So these are the principles we have in this code of conduct that was developed by the agri-food chain industries. If you move to the next slide. One of the things we did in the code, and that was about 2 years of work, was to look at examples. And what you see on the screen here looks like a quite complex chart, but that's the point. It is quite complex. If you have a rather simple task of trying to grow potatoes as a farmer using the services of a contractor, and you want to look at what flow of data, when, how it can be shared and all this, this is what it looks like. So you better have principles behind this. You better have trust. You better have a good understanding through a contractual arrangement of what can be done by whom and where. We got 4 examples like this in the code, and we can get back to some of those if you want to. Next slide. So how did this sectorial initiative start? It was an initiative at the beginning between 3 main trade associations for the industry: the farmers, COPA-COGECA, Fertilizer Europe, producers of fertilizers, and CEMA for the ag machinery. We spent about 2 years developing this code. It was extended to the whole industry in September 2017 before it was released by in the presence of then Commissioner for Agriculture, Phil Hogan, and the cabinet of Commissioner Gabriel, who was at that time in charge of digital. Both are still in the new commission, but under new responsibilities. It has now been extended to 11 signatories. It's again voluntary, but it's been received with quite a lot of interest, because if you look at, for example, this joint declaration on the key role of smart farming in the agri-food sector that was endorsed and signed by 25 member states last year in April, it does a key reference to the code of conduct of the sector. More recently, if you look into this European strategy for data, it was released by the Commission in February 2020, it also has a chapter on the common agricultural data space, which references the code of conduct as one of the unique voluntary initiatives that sectors have been taken. So there's a lot of history behind this code, a lot of time to get to the content that we now have. Next slide, please. But of course, the work isn't finished yet. There's still a few remaining hurdles that we need to address as the industry. We did talk about trust for data sharing. That's the principle of the code, but that also needs to be met by trust by proper design of technology. And when asking the farmers what really matters in data sharing for agricultural purposes, you'll see those 3 points here. Farmers want that all data can be made available on the platform of their choice. They want to be able to be free to choose the applications of their choice, and they want to make sure they don't need a data engineer to take care of the data transfer. So in our world, this means we still have remaining technical barriers to make sure that this transfer can be done in an easy way, in a protected way, and in an automated way. Next slide, please. So this means we have some technical solutions to look into for the industry. And here, of course, we can rely on application program interfaces, APIs, or PKIs, the public key infrastructures, to work on this. And new technologies like blockchain do present a lot of promises to handle this, but some of the solutions also need to be handled by the whole chain. And this is where we will also have to have some common data governance rules, which take care of not only the rules for organization and technical and legal purposes, but also the tools and processes that determine the better use of the data. And sorry, we're just scratching the surface here, but I only have 10 minutes to cover this very important ground for the industry. But of course, I remain available for any question you may have. Thank you for the listening.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yes, thank you, Christina. At this point, we would like to engage you all through a few Mentimeter questions. You see above in the slide presented by Christina, you see how you get into Mentimeter by menti.com and using the code 174336. Thank you. The question is, were you familiar with the EU Code of Conduct on agricultural data sharing by contractual agreement prior to the start of this webinar? I see already answers coming in. Yeah, that's. I see a rather balanced view there regarding familiarity. So I think especially for the group who was already familiar with them, have you used the principles, or maybe then in a different way? Maybe based on the own set of principles. That's of course also possible. Okay. So I think you could say here, for a part, there's familiarity, but then still the application is behind. Very interested to hear a little more about that. Yeah. and then on to from current use to future use. Now that you've seen this on high level presented by Jérôme, would you consider using it? Could it really help evolve your current activities? That's an interesting view, huh, Jérôme?
Absolutely.
Are you aware of other initiatives that are comparable to the EU code? So maybe for the ones who are entering, yes, if you would in the chat, if you would like to share in the chat which ones you're referring to, that would be great. So for the ones already experienced somehow in this, how would you evaluate the success of the code of conduct in fostering trust in data sharing? As this is, of course, one of the main contributions of the COC. I think, of course, the higher not applicable relates, of course, to the usage and familiarity. But for the ones who have used it, you see that it has been supportive in fostering trust. Moderate and good. Yeah, okay.
But some people say moderate, and there are a few that say poor. I would love to hear actually why.
Yeah.
I'm sure Jérôme would like that too, no?
Sure.
Yeah. Maybe in the chat.
Yes, because yeah, I can imagine also indeed to now collect in the chat, and then when we go on to the discussion, you're setting a bit of the scene as well, Simone, and then we can gather those views in the discussion. How would you evaluate the practical usability of the COC? And this is our last question, by the way, regarding this this baseline that Jérôme has now set. Yeah, it's kind of the same view, huh? It's kind of comparable to really the usefulness for fostering trust. So we'll keep this in mind for the discussion later. Comparable view. Thank you. So with this as I would say setting the scene regarding code of conduct, I would really now like to invite Simone to share her reflections and perspective on the code of conduct.
Thank you very much. Is it possible to that I can share my screen, or yeah, share. Yeah, great. Let's see, can I control it now or not? Yes. Let's see, how can I, oh no. Now I see a lot of things, but I cannot get rid of the chat. The difficulty is now that I cannot make a full screen, it seems.
If you click on your presentation,
yeah,
you can minimize the chat and you would be able to make a full presentation, or F5 also works.
F5. Okay. Let's see, F5. Yeah, okay, thank you. So thank you very much for inviting me to join here. So there's a lot to say about the code of conduct, and here in 10 minutes I'm only able to do a little bit, and so I see it as my primary task to enhance discussion a little bit and reflection. So I'm an ethicist, a moral philosopher, and I have a role in IOF 2020. I lead the work package on ethics there. So I think a lot of you are familiar with IOF 2020, Internet of Food 2020. So I guess SmartAgriHubs is a kind of continuation of this. So I thought let's broaden a little bit our view of this. I thought it would be interesting to look at what kind of strategy the European Commission has chosen here. So we have these different approaches to how we should deal with data, right? So in China, in very broad characterizations, the state determines what is being done with data. And in the US, there are large companies that are in charge of farm data. But in Europe, we're quite interested in avoiding power concentrations. So we strive towards having a more diverse landscape of larger and smaller parties that determine together how data should be governed. So we want to avoid monopolies, for example. And this actually, I'm making this explicit because I want to show that you actually, all of the audience, is in charge here in shaping this landscape, this diverse landscape, and also to shape our data sharing future. So you are the ones that carry responsibility for that and make the choices about it. So this is a very complex and very exciting task. And in this sense, yeah, it's very interesting to have this initiative of creating this code of conduct. So we have the GDPR, which is legislation, but it only concentrates on privacy, on protection of privacy and private data. And private data or personal data is any information which is related to an identified or identifiable natural person. So this can be directly identifiable or indirectly. So for example, by having information about a certain location of a farm, and by knowing it's, for example, an arable farm, then sometimes if you know the area, you know who it is. So then indirectly you would know who that person is, and so this person is indirectly identifiable. But the GDPR actually focuses on that information that is directly identifiable, and also on sensitive personal information, like, for example, your medical records. But for non-personal data, and farm data are usually considered non-personal data, the free flow regulation applies. So the free flow regulation actually says we should let those data flow freely, and so that everybody can use it and benefit from it. And regarding that free flow regulation, they say, well, some of these data are rather complex. So for example, the farm data are quite complex, and for that we need to self-regulate. So we need to find out together how we're using those data and what types of uses we want to prevent. So this is a little bit of the background of that code of conduct. So the Code of Conduct has approached the question of self-regulation in a straightforward way. It said, come on, we're going to shape trust by means of a contract, which is very practical, of course. And this contract acknowledges the right of all parties to protect sensitive information like IP rights. It recognizes the right of the data originator to control the use of the data and determine who can have access to it. And the contract should be stated in a clear language which specifies specific things. So it specifies terms and conditions, the purpose of collecting, sharing, and processing data, rights and obligations that parties have related to data, information on how data are stored, verification mechanisms for the data originator. So that's the person who collects or creates data or who commissions others to collect those data. And it should have transparent mechanisms for adding new or future uses. So this is quite a lot of information that you should include in those contracts. And these are generally the principles. So I wanted to highlight those a little bit because it shows that it's actually oriented towards protecting people, right? So the data ownership is of central importance here. Data ownership means actually that the data originator, so that is the person who creates data or collects data or commissions others to collect data, and it ascribes this person rights to control what is happening to the data. So who has access to it and for what purposes these data are used. So data access is covered with that. It is saying that the data owner should control access and portability, for example. Data should be protected. So not everybody can have access to it. So it cannot occur, data sharing cannot occur with third parties that you don't know in advance will have access to these data. Privacy law applies, so private data should be protected and intellectual property rights should also be protected. So these principles are very much focusing on protection against misuse of data. And this is a very important aspect of trust, of course. You want to trust others not to misuse your data. But if we evaluate this, then I think it has some really clear strengths, right? It's really a serious attempt to protect the personal interests, rights, and freedoms of data originators. And it's shaped by actors in the ecosystem, so it's therefore supported by them. This is also really important, right? Because it's a kind of a first stage that if it's supported by people, then there's a chance that it will be used. And it helps to move towards a practical solution, which is a contract. But it also has some obvious weaknesses. And now I cannot read my own slide because there's a lot in front of it. So there's, for example, no specific attention to more societal values that can be at stake with data sharing. And so the code of conduct is shaped by actors in the ecosystem, but these actors think more like businessmen and women and not really like citizens in a society that are actually contributing to the European society. So as self-legislators or self-regulators, we might maybe expect that people would position themselves also as citizens and think also about the societal values that are at stake. So this is an invite actually to think about it a little bit further. And the third point, or maybe weakness, is that a contract is quite difficult to shape if the data sharing network is expanding. So if you have only 10 clients, it's quite easy to sit around the table and form a contract. But if you start to have 10,000 or maybe even 50,000 or 100,000 clients, then it's quite difficult to shape contracts. And of course, solutions have been developed to deal with this. People have been making digital versions of contracts, so that it becomes easier to sign them and to acquire the information about the people who are going to use your data, and then give access to those data by consenting. However, you could think that maybe giving consent in this way has a chance to become quite hollow, because usually when you sit around the table and you form a contract, then you can talk through the terms and you can make sure that everybody understands those terms and gets the appropriate information. However, if you digitize this process, then maybe it becomes, this informative aspect becomes a lot less elaborate. So I have a proposal to make, and I would like to invite you to think along with me about that. So we might think a little bit beyond the EU code. So I think it's still very important to protect the people who are sharing their data. So I think it's still important to have these contracts. However, I think that if the data sharing network expands, this cannot be a very, very elaborate contract. So it should be a quite informal one that you can sign by ticking a box, much in the way in which you tick boxes when you download an app from the internet and you sign the privacy agreement. So, so you should have this contract, you should give explicit consent to sharing your data, but then we need to develop something else together to think about the play rules that we want to accept regarding the shared data on a platform. So, so if several actors are connected to a data platform, like for example, Join Data or Just Connect, we could think about play rules regarding the use of those data on the platform. So, and within those play rules, we could also integrate a thought about the societal purposes for which these data could be used. So in that sense, we could look at data on platforms as a kind of commons. So commons are resources that everyone, or that a group of people or society as a whole could use. But just like other commons, like the roads, like education, like clean air, like water, all of these resources, we can use them only if we satisfy certain conditions. So regarding data, we should probably think together about what type of conditions we would have to satisfy if we are to use the data that are gathered together on a platform. So this is a thought, right? And this is going to, so I would like to invite you to think about this, about the development of play rules. So why should we think broader about these societal values? This is because society has quite high expectations of the digitization of agriculture. So the investments that the European Commission does in digitization of agriculture is because they expect it to contribute to the goals of the Food 2030 agreement and the Green Deal. So, so they're expecting an increase of production of healthy and nutritious food and enough food for a growing population. And they're hoping that it will reduce the burden for the environment and that less natural resources will be used. Well, these are, of course, the very broad ideals that are attached to smart farming. However, we could ask what this implies for data sharing and for the governance of our data. For it might mean, for example, that we need to monitor whether and to what extent digital farming is actually contributing to these goals. So we might say that perhaps researchers need to have access to some of the data in order to be able to research how digital farming is contributing to these ends. And policymakers might need these data or the information extracted from it to inform their policy in order to know where they have to make changes in order, for example, to reduce the burden of farming on the environment. And maybe citizens at large should have access as well, because it might foster their awareness of the burden on the environment of certain types of food production. And this might change their choices, their purchase choices in the supermarket. And apart from that, we could say that data could also be considered a basis for knowledge that everybody needs to have access to, just like we have access to books in a library. So this is a quote from the European Data Strategy, which illustrates a little bit the ideal behind this, that the European Commission would actually like citizens to be empowered by data, so to have access to those data. So this is my last slide, and this is an invite for you all to participate in considering these questions for the play rules of data platforms. So again, data platforms are not really single farm management systems, for example, but they consider platforms where different solutions come together and different actors share data together for a variety of purposes. So when we consider those play roles for the platform, we could think about what data are we actually talking, and who can use these data, how can they use the data, and for what private or societal goals do we allow to use the data? So what conditions should the use of our data satisfy? Who can decide how we use the data? So until now, we made individual data originators the only responsible ones to decide about this. And I think this is still important, but I think we could also develop rules at a higher level for platforms as a whole in order to be able to think together also about the societal goals that this could serve. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Simone. Now let's use Ventimater to process what we've just heard. And as a beginning of discussion, I already see some interesting things going on in the chat, which we'll refer to in a moment. But let's all together process making use of a few questions. First, do you have or are you involved as a partner in a data platform? Okay, quite an even spread. Okay, so this is, yeah, this contextualizes the viewpoints of our participants. Yeah, so it's okay. Most, you know, it would become more and more omnipresent, you would say, in agriculture innovation. The next question, would you be open to considering data as commons, as Simone has just outlined? For instance, as resources that can be used by public actors under certain conditions? Ah, wow. That is interesting. That's an interesting view, huh, Simone?
Yes, definitely. I would also like to know why people are hesitant, for example. I see a few no's and a few not sure's. I would really like to know, to invite those people also in the chat to share their opinion.
Yeah. Do you think agricultural data, in particular, has a societal goal to fulfill? That is, yeah, okay. In my experience, this is one of the first times that it has been explicated so clearly that a lot of people would agree with that it serves a societal goal. Very interesting.
Yeah, but not everybody is participating, huh? So we're a bit biased here. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Because
that's
there
true.
are 90 participants, and I think only 40 answered the question.
Indeed, indeed. That's the light with which we have to view this. True. What is the first societal goal for which you would be prepared to share agricultural data from your platform? Yeah. Okay. So mainly research. Maybe that also, maybe it's linked to the profile of our participants today, possibly.
Yeah, that is very possible. So it would be lovely to hear. Yeah, but we can't find out right now, so that's too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What actors would you involve in shaping the, I see there's a blog in front of us, shaping the play rules of the agricultural data platform? What actors would you involve in this, creating this commons, as Simone explained? Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is, of course, also a bit dependent, I think, in the sector that you're most active in. Wow. A big web of actors.
Yeah, but I see lots of them, right? So farmers,
Yes.
NGOs, it's yeah.
Yes.
Also,
Media.
and
Yeah.
policymakers, ministry.
Yes.
Citizens
even media
also.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thankfully, yes. Yeah.
Biodiversity, rural initiatives of biodiversity, that's interesting as well.
Yes.
Producers, tech suppliers.
Pharmaceutical.
Yeah, so
Also, you see pharmaceutical and yeah, WHO. So that's also, I think, the perspective you take on your domain, the type of data. Yeah. What conditions should agricultural data use for public purposes satisfy, in your opinion? And this is the last question of Mentimeter, by the way.
Yeah, openness is of course a very nice one, but at the same time, I think for conditions we're thinking about under what conditions can you be open, right? Because nobody would simply open up everything to everybody. I don't think. So we need to think about for what purposes we want to do that. Fairness, sustainability, that's a really nice one. And on minimization, of course, that's a really nice one. Yeah.
So given as we have 15 minutes, yeah. No, I want to say, given as we have 15 minutes left, and there's quite some activity in the chat. The activity that I see is first of all linked to also your first question, Simona, your last slide. What data are we talking about? When is data personal or not, and how do we define that? And I see, for instance, Anne, you're active on this here. Would you maybe like to elaborate a little bit on this, Anne Bruinsma?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I was just taking a bite of my sandwich.
Sorry.
Yeah, and so I'm a representative of an initiative called Farmhack, and we are involved in a flagship innovation experiment. And we're actually doing research on machine data. We have done some research using an open source data logger to actually see and find out what type of data an ag machine, so especially the tractor. So what type of technical data does this machine produce? We have considered the option of regarding this type of data as personal data because of the very strong, it's georeferenced. There's a timestamp, which makes it, if you look at all the data that this machine and the implement behind it produce over a year, it gives you a very, very detailed view of what has been happening on a plot or all of the land of a farmer. Just as part of the research, it's not done yet, so we're in the midst of it. But we have deep dived a few of the contracts that are out there between the type of contracts that a farmer has to sign when he buys a tractor. And even though even in the US or in Europe, these type of companies say out loud that they submit to legislation such as the GDPR or even the Code of Conduct, these type of contracts are never clear on many issues. It leaves out a lot of clarity on the elements where it becomes tricky. So even though the principles in the Code of Conduct are good and strong and they do lead us to the type of debates that we need to have, the current status quo in the market still leaves the farmer very vulnerable in a sense of how to deal with machine data himself. So in that regards, access to that type of data, CEMA actually is saying in their last strategy or point of, I'm not quite sure how to say it, but they have been communicating that they feel that the access to machine data should be the cloud of the industry, the cloud platform of the takkerfabrikant. I'm sorry, I lost for the English term. So these are all points of views that do not, particularly are not in sync with the Code of Conduct, but the implications of it are not very clear. So I strongly feel that we also need like the technical point of view of what are we talking about, what are the implications, and how do we make sure that the farmer is also served in his interests. And you can talk about privacy. Another interesting issue is, how does the market, how do we come up with a data governance model that also foresees in protecting the interest of a farmer in the sense of a fair share for the reuse of that type of data? So yeah, I can talk for a long time, but just as a little elaboration, maybe this suffices.
Yeah. Great to see your practical perspective on this, Anna. And maybe because this is indeed elaborating on the future, Jérôme, if I could go back to you, maybe are there cases or even statistics on the adoption of the CRC? And
yeah, thanks for the question. Statistics on adoption, to my knowledge, no, because again, this is not legislation and it's voluntary. and its principles that we recommend collectively as the signatories. So a collection of industry representation, that this is taken up as principles in the contractual arrangements. So it is indeed extremely difficult to have metrics around this. You can do samples, you can look at some of those contractual arrangements and look for the references, look for languages, look for, but that's not the intent of the code. The intent of the code is to put together a common approach to principles, definitions, what is recommended as use, and the precautions that should be taken when this is addressed. So again, it's not legislation. It's something which is voluntary, and it was there to leverage willingness and the understanding that if we share data, there's going to be value created, and we're going to be able to do better sustainable farming than what we could do previously. But if we don't build the trust, which is the first stone to build upon, then the usage will be extremely limited. And Anna was referencing to maybe mixing a little bit of different things, because what she was referring to, if I understand correctly, is the position that CEMA released a couple of weeks ago on what are the next steps, as how do we jointly work into a digital strategy that can actually deliver this. And of course you will have to rely on the manufacturers' systems there for most of the data that is being emitted by a tractor, because if you don't have that, then nobody can use the data, and some of that data again will be protected, some of that data will just be the functioning of the machine, and some of that, but the principle is to have a code that sets up the environment in which you elaborate the trust, so that then you can work on the technology and the practical solutions. One thing I wanted to react to is, I mean, the whole notion of precision farming, digital farming, the evolution that we're currently seeing in farming, this is not adopted to fulfill the EU goals. The Commission strategies, these things go together, but farmers will adopt new technologies and engage into new developments now because they need to create value, and because you need to have a response on the three elements of sustainable development. Yes, there's a social dimension to this. Yes, there's an economic dimension to this. And yes, there's an environmental dimension to this. But to better have a good approach to both competitiveness and more sustainable farm help and willingness to do in practical terms, not more just in overall societal terms and goals.
Can I react to that? Because this is a nice start of a discussion.
Yes.
Well, it depends how you frame it. Of course, you can look at yourself as a farmer that has a business to run, and that has that may have specific business reasons to start to digitize the farm and to share data with other people. So yes, of course, there's this dimension to it, and there are also business dimensions for the developers of the technologies and the platforms. So I'm not contradicting this at all. And I'm not saying that this is wrong or anything. So these are completely understandable reasons and good reasons to do things. Yet at the same time, I think the European Commission is also investing in this and has kind of very large goals in view for this, and it's handing over responsibility to self-regulate the whole field and the dealings with data that open an opportunity to also think about societal goals. So it's not like we have to, we don't have the European Commission doesn't tell us you have to now solve these problems for us, but it's an opportunity to also think about this as citizens. Like, what if what will happen if we think of these data also as commons and as an opportunity to actually deliver new knowledge that we might profit from, all of us, for societal goals as well. So it's simply a next level in thinking about how we can use this, and it's not contradicting the economic goals that we might have with it or the business goals we might have with it, but it's a next layer that we could add to this. That's how I look at it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Given the time, and we could go on for a long time, I think, but for sure this will be picked up later. Given the time, I would like to ask you both for a final statement for all the participants to digest further upon. So Jérôme, if I can ask you to do your final statement, please.
Sure, thanks again for the opportunity. I think we're at the very exciting times because technology is evolving extremely quickly. We have a whole world of development, and I mean, people on this webinar, if I was reading through the comments, have a good understanding of what amount of opportunities we have ahead of us for precision farming, digital solutions, and just a revolution and evolution in agriculture that we're seeing. At the same time, I think we need to have a practical assessment of what it takes to build the trust. Because like in any other area linked to data, and I think the GDPR was an essential pillar in progressing on those matters, if there's not trust at the beginning, we will have very little opportunity to engage in the usage of the data so that it can be done in a way that in the end it delivers benefits. So yes, there are societal dimensions to this. We're not denying this, obviously not. And yes, we have overall goals that we want to achieve. But at the same time, we need to have those practical initiatives that turn it in a way that can be usable for all the stakeholders that actually help in the agri-food chain, so that in the end we have safe food on the shelves in the supermarkets that we choose. Thank you.
Thank you, Jérôme. Simone, if I may ask you your final statement.
Yes, sure. There are lots of different ways to think about trust, and building trust by contractual agreements is one of the ways, and it's an important way, and I do think it has a role to play in this field. Yet trust is also built by speaking together about the general goals that we might realize with this, and these might include also the societal goals, it seems to me. And just like we have rules that govern our traffic, or that govern the use of data from biobanks, or the use of books from a library, we could have shared rules that govern how we use data gathered on a platform. So it seems to me that this is not unpractical because we have it in different areas of society already. It just adds an extra layer to thinking about how we can foster trust, because having control by means of a contract is just one of the ways in which we can establish trust, but it's also we can also build this trust by speaking together about how we want these data to be shared, with whom, for what purposes, and what the restrictions are, as a shared reservoir of data, and as a set of play rules for a shared reservoir of data. So I guess that's my last statement. And I think what is very important about this webinar actually is I thought it was very interesting to see the support for the building of these play rules for societal goals, and I thought that was really interesting to see. And I also think that it's important to see that code of conduct is not yet well known by everybody, and so so this is something to take into account in next steps that ought to be taken, it seems to me.
Indeed, Simone.
Yes. Well, on behalf of SmartAgriHubs and specifically Work Package 4, I'd like to thank Simone and Jérôme for contributing to this webinar, and of course all the participants for sharing their views and responses. In the screen we can see some upcoming webinars that we still have planned. June 18, the first one will be on strategy for digital innovation hubs. So I hope to meet you again there. Thank you very much. This was really very, very interesting and indeed a topic for following up in the near future. Thank you very much and enjoy your day.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.